So I want to tell you a bit about this national center that we've created and give you a few tastes for the kind of neuroscience that we do, which is mostly developmental neuroscience. So we're very interested in what happens to the brain early in life with this specific focus on autism, on what might happen differently in the brains of kids who develop autism. But before I dive into that, I have to start with a personal note. So this handsome character right here, third one from the left, this is Professor Ilan Dinstein, who is my father, and he retired from the electrical engineering department of BGU about 10 years ago. So this is a family business, and I'm very proud to be the second generation here. Thanks. So I came to BGU in 2012 and opened up a neuroscience lab in the psychology department. We use techniques like MRI. You'll hear a lot about MRIs today. And we also use EEGs in order to study both how the brain is structured, so brain anatomy, and also how it functions. So we can see actual neural responses with both of these techniques. And we apply these techniques with these amazing students to study autism. And I assume that most of you are it's not the first time you're exposed to this topic, right? It's all over the popular press and in books and movies. And that's because of this incredible prevalence, which is rising over the years. So here you see the 1 in 59 figure, which was accurate in 2018, and today we're up to 1 in 44, according to the CDC. Those numbers are accurate for the US. Just to make sure that we all know what we're talking about, I put the formal definition of autism up here. So what you see there is a picture of the DSM. That's the Bible for psychiatry. And that's where autism is defined. And it's defined according to 2 core symptoms. The first one is something called social communication difficulties. Right? So I assume many of us have some form of social communication difficulty. I know I do. My wife tells me that a lot. But to be more specific, what clinicians look for in children who come in for the diagnosis, they look for problems in creating eye contact, problems initiating play. So kids with autism will often not be interested in playing with others. They won't respond to initiations by other folks. They also, you know how we teach kids often to learn new things by imitating. So we'll show them an object and they'll try to imitate us, so that happens a lot less in autism. And then the second symptom is repetitive behaviors and confined interests, which means that kids with autism will often be bored. It's almost an obsession with a certain toy or a certain topic, like train locomotors. So they'll like to interact on that topic or play with that specific toy and not do other things. And repetitive behaviors refers to stereotypical movements like rocking of the torso and flapping hands and movements that are easy to identify. A really important issue about autism is that it's developmental. So development is a really important word here. You can't create autism in an adult. So you can't have a 20-year-old be in a car accident or have a traumatic brain injury or something like that and develop autism. Autism has to develop within the first 3-4 years of life. And that's a really important clue to the neuroscience of autism, because it means that something in the overall development of the brain is happening differently. It's not a specific location, like a lesion that you might have in a stroke or something like that, where a certain brain area stops functioning. That's not autism. Autism is something in the holistic development of the brain that happens differently. And so those are the core symptoms of autism, but autism exhibits a lot of heterogeneity. And I like this slide because it shows you several issues that are apparent in some kids with autism, but not in all. So on the top left here, you see a child with a strong sensory response to auditory stimulation. So some children are very hyper-responsive. Next here is a child showing a tantrum. So some kids are very, they can even get aggressive or be a bit violent, which is a problem in some of the children. Below them, you can see an example of a child with some dysmorphology. So this is a child who has Fragile X syndrome. It's a specific genetic syndrome, and half of the kids with Fragile X have autism. And next to them, I brought 3 photos of very famous cases of autism. So on the bottom in the middle there, you see Temple Grandin, who is a famous advocate for the autism community. She didn't speak until she was 6 years old, but then developed to become this amazing lecturer. She has wonderful books about autism, if you're interested in the topic, and there's a wonderful movie about her as well. And she has a PhD and is doing very well for herself. So you see these communication problems and very large early delays, but then with amazing other capabilities that emerge later in life. That happens in some cases. Next to them is Carly Fleischman, who is not verbal to this day. Actually, nobody knew that she was able to communicate until she sat next to a computer at the age of 13 and started typing, and has written poetry and done amazing things since then, but still cannot talk. And beneath her is Stephen Wiltshire, who is an amazing artist, a British artist, who also has severe communication difficulties, but is able to fly over London and Rome and paint the most accurate pictures you can think of the cities themselves. So an amazing artistic ability. So I'm going, at length about all of these cases to describe this heterogeneity, which is very common in autism, and it's apparent in a wide variety of what we call secondary symptoms. So you see them in this outlying circle. And they have to do, some of them include sleep problems, digestive problems, and a bunch of other issues. And the reason to talk so much about this is that this is creating a really important change in the way we do research about autism. And instead of thinking of it as a single entity, as one disorder, it's becoming very clear that there are many types of autism and many forms of autism, and they have different causes, and they're likely to require different treatments and different therapies. So we already know about some specific types of autism, like Rett and Fragile X, that I mentioned a moment ago. These are genetic type forms or syndromes that cause autism. But there are many others. About 80% of the autism population are not part of that, so we don't know what's happening there. And in order to figure that out and really identify or make progress with understanding these different types of autism, it's really important for us to study autism in a multidisciplinary fashion, like Danny said a moment ago, with scientists from different fields who drink a lot of coffee together, from behavioral studies and genetics and molecular biology and physiology. And it's really important that all of us study the same kids, because we have to relate our findings, right? If there's a certain genetic abnormality, I want to know what the neuroimaging or the brain structure will look like in that particular subgroup of kids with autism. And so it's really important to have these shared databases, and none of this existed in Israel before we came into the picture. And so I want to show you a little video clip about, we actually started working on autism a few years before the Ministry of Science came out with this amazing opportunity to create a national center. And we initially called our regional center the Negev Autism Center. And I want to show you a little movie about how we work at the center.
Over the last 2 years, scientists from Ben-Gurion University and physicians from Soroka Medical Center have been building the Negev Autism Center. This is the first center in Israel that combines community clinical care and autism research in the same location. Approximately 150 children with autism are diagnosed at Soroka Medical Center every year. The diagnosis of autism requires multiple visits in which clinicians interview the parents and directly assess the behavior of the child in order to determine whether an autism diagnosis is appropriate. By integrating the research into the diagnosis visits and later follow-up visits, scientists at BGU are able to collect a wide variety of data from a large number of children without requiring additional visits to the lab. This data includes detailed information about the child and family from the Soroka Electronic Patient Record System. behavioral information from voice and video recordings of the child during interactions with the clinical staff, parental questionnaires about sensory sensitivities and sleep habits, saliva samples for genetic testing, blood samples for metabolic testing, eye tracking while watching TV, and even EEG recordings during sleep. This research is unique and extremely rare on a global scale because it combines a wide variety of data from each of the children that are captured at the earliest stages of their development, when autism symptoms are first emerging. Today, scientists around the world agree that autism is not one disorder, but rather a family of distinct disorders that are likely to have different causes. By combining multiple types of data, the interdisciplinary team at the Negev Autism Center hopes to identify these distinct subgroups of children and match each subgroup with the most efficacious targeted treatments. These qualities and goals make the Negev Autism Center the leader in translational autism research in Israel and the entire Middle East.
Okay, so that's the Negev Autism Research Center, which is now the National Autism Research Center. And I wanted to really emphasize an important point here, which is the collaboration between the clinic and the science. Okay, so that is something that is unfortunately very rare in the world, and which we have really successfully done in this collaboration, where we have our scientific teams working inside the clinic, inside Soroka, which is the biggest medical center. It's the only medical center in the entire south of Israel. It's like a healthcare monopoly. And this has a huge advantage for the kind of research that we're trying to do. And what I want to do now is I want to introduce you to the team and then give you a few examples of the kinds of research that we do at the center. So there's a combination of this multidisciplinary team includes several types of different research. So sitting next to me on the right here is Ilan Dinstein, who is a geneticist and an epidemiologist. Ilan has single-handedly created the only genetics database for autism in Israel. I'll tell you a few more words about that later. He also does a lot of work in studying risk factors of autism using the clinical records from Soroka. So because Soroka is the only hospital in the Negev, we can go back to the pregnancy records and the birth records and the neonatal care unit and a bunch of other places and learn amazing things about the potential risk factors for developing autism. Next to Ilan is Gal Meiri, who is a child psychiatrist. He's the clinician in our group. He's the autism expert in the south of Israel. He does many of the diagnoses himself. Amazingly compassionate man. And his main interest is in understanding treatment and early diagnosis. And next to Gal is Chava Golan, who does all the preclinical work. She works with, there are mouse models of autism. And the interesting thing about mouse models of autism is that it enables the scientists to try and figure out new treatments for autism. And so Chava is developing diets, supplementary diets, that might be helpful for some cases of autism. Together, we've built this database, which today has over 1,000 families. So this is work that within 3 or 4 years, we've created the largest database in Israel. And we were initially, this is pretty remarkable because think about what we're doing here. We're approaching families during the earliest stages when all of their focus is on the diagnosis, right? So this is a very emotional and difficult point in their lives, and we were initially very hesitant about approaching them with research, but our experience with the families has actually been amazing, and they, we have these amazing meetings where we thank each other for our efforts, and over 80% of the families agree to participate in the research. So here you see the ages of the kids when we first meet them. You see that many of them are actually very young, below the age of 4. We see the typical 4-to-1 ratio between males and females. So there are 4 times as many boys with autism as there are girls. And next there you see that big advantage that I told you about, that the vast majority are born in Soroka, so we have a tremendous amount of additional information about them. And the pie chart on the right shows you that about a quarter of the kids are from the Bedouin population. And the Bedouin population are a very interesting population in and of themselves that I don't have too much time to tell you about. But because these are nomadic Arabs who live in the south of Israel, and they still live in a very tribal community, and they tend to marry within their communities. And so what that means is that about 2/3 of the children with Bedouin who are in our database have parents who are first cousins. And that's a really unique situation to be doing genetic research in, because it really simplifies a lot of the problems that geneticists often have in identifying what is the genetic cause for a disorder. So that's a very interesting direction. Okay, so this is a symposium about neuroscience, so I brought in some, you can imagine that there's a whole wealth of projects at the center. I brought in just a few examples. One example that I'm very proud of is this project with Professor Ilan Dinstein, who is the chief radiologist of Soroka. We found out that about a quarter of the database that I just told you about are kids with autism who have undergone an MRI scan in the hospital in Soroka at some point during the first 5 years of life. And we're very surprised initially that there were so many brain scans, but this is a huge opportunity for us to try and understand what's happening, particularly with anatomical development in these kids. And we've already found this interesting finding that in about 10% of the kids, we find this excess in cerebrospinal fluid, which is a fluid that covers your entire brain. And what you see in these scans, the top left here in white or in black on the right panel, these are 2 different MRI scans of the same child. You see this excess in fluid, and that's abnormal. That shouldn't be there. And this raises a very interesting hypothesis about a potential mechanism in some of these autism cases where the problem might be happening because of an excess fluid that's causing pressure on frontal lobes, and this liquid isn't circulating properly as well. And so this could be a potential mechanism, and we're not the only ones who are seeing it. There's another group in California who have just reported the same. This could be a particular mechanism for considerable number of kids who we're seeing, and that's relevant for early detection of autism and potentially for thinking about a specific treatment to change that. Another great project that I'm really proud of is looking at sleep in the toddlers. So being a young parent myself, I still remember sleep deprivation as one of the big issues of parenthood. And it turns out that in autism, it's a lot worse. So what you see here are parental reports of sleep problems in kids. And you can get a feeling for those 340 children that are on the left-hand side. You see how those points are much higher. So about half of the kids with autism have really severe sleep problems, which are basically insomnia. It means that they're sleeping about half of what they should. Now think about, you don't have to be a neuroscientist to know that if you haven't slept well during the night, right, this has a big impact on how quickly you respond, all of your abilities to learn new things and to, all of the cognitive abilities that we rely on. And so it's my personal opinion that better clinical care of these sleep problems might actually have a big impact on autism care and on development of young children. And so in order to study that more deeply, what we do is we bring in the kids for overnight EEG exams. This is together with Professor Ariel Trasiuk from the sleep lab in Soroka. And we attach EEG electrodes, and we actually measure their brain activity while they're sleeping. And what you see here is a typically developing child. This is my older daughter, Ronnie. She's sleeping. You see these very large waves, right? These are slow and large waves. This is what characterizes deep sleep early in the night. And these are shallow fast waves that happen later on during light sleep. And the most important part of your night is that deep sleep. When the fact that you wake up and the restorative part of sleep has to do with those very large waves. And what you can see down here in the bottom panel, you see the amplitude of these waves, the power of these waves in a typically developing child in blue versus an autistic child in red. And you can already see that in those first segments of the night, this autistic child is sleeping a lot less deeply. It's a much more superficial sleep. And we see that across the group. So we've had about 40 kids with autism and 40 controls. We see that happening in many of them. And when we look at a child-by-child image, so each black dot here on the right side is a child with autism, you see that those with the lowest power, the most superficial sleep, are those who are falling asleep the latest and have the biggest trouble. And this is actually a huge problem, because if any one of us were sleep deprived and then fell asleep, we would have much, much deeper sleep with much larger waves than if we weren't. And these kids they seem to not be developing this pressure to sleep. It's as if they're not tired enough. And they're staying with brain activity that characterizes awake brains, okay, that's much faster. And so this is pointing us at therapeutics. So there are several ways of generating sleep pressure. One of them is to just tire the kids out. That would be the simplest thing. So make them run around more. And that actually is no joke, because there's some concern that kids with autism who are in specialized kindergartens don't get enough opportunity for activity, because they're constantly in one-on-one therapies and other situations where they don't run around outside with the other kids. So that's the easy form, and of course there are medications that can help with this as well, and hopefully also have an impact on the development of the kids. And then the last example I'll show you of research on these lines has to do with behavior. And so, so we have all these measures of the brain and brain activity and brain anatomy, but we're also really interested in relating them to measures of autism that are apparent in the behavior of the children. And one way that we can do that, we want something that we can quantify by measuring the child directly. We want to stop relying on the reports of other people, like the parents and the clinicians, and we want to have measures that directly measure the social problems in each one of the kids. And so one really interesting way to do that is using eye trackers. So what you see here is a 2.5-year-old child who's we strap them into a car seat, and we tilt them back so that they're comfortable and they can't move that much. And then we show them a bunch of movies, and what kid doesn't like to watch movies? And I'll show you an example of the kind of movies that we show them. So this is actually our most successful movie. This is, you get to meet both of my daughters here from a few years ago, and they're going to have a serious interaction in a moment. And what you see here is each one of these green dots is the location of the eye gaze of a different child with autism. So this is where they're looking while they're watching this movie. And now the drama starts. So you can tell who's boss in our house, right? Okay. So we've had amazing success with this movie. And I think that one of the reasons that, and when I say success, I mean that we can identify about half of the kids with autism by analyzing how they watch this movie, okay? And the kind of analyses that we do, we show the same movie also to typically developing kids. You see them, and this is just one image from that movie, you see them here in blue, and that cross signifies the mean location of the control group. So typically developing kids, they pretty much agree on what's interesting during each part of the movie. They tend to look at faces, and there are parts where actually it's more important to look at the hand pulling the hair or the hand showing the object, or because there's a lot of context here, right? There's a whole narrative there. And so we show this movie to typically developing kids. We look at the mean, and then we see how far is each one of these children from the mean of the group. And we find that kids with autism, about half of them, are looking at just random other things in the frame. You can kind of get a feeling for it here. You see those green dots that are very far from that cross, from the mean of the controls. And this gives us an individual measure. The further you are from the control group, the more social problems you basically have. That's the bottom line. And so this is an individual measure that might be very useful for early detection. It might be very useful for following up a child and seeing how they progress over time. Do they get better? Do they start watching this movie more similarly to the control kids after they have some therapy? So this is why this is so useful. So we combine a real strength of the center is that we combine all of these techniques and different research directions with genetics that I mentioned a moment ago that Ilan has created. So we're the only center in Israel who contribute to this very large effort called the Autism Sequencing Consortium. This is a huge international effort to sequence the genetics of 50,000 individuals with autism. It's run by the NIH here in the US. And we've contributed a meager 200 families to this collection so far. But this is really important research for several reasons. One, this is our big opportunity to see whether the genetics of autism that have been reported elsewhere in the US and Europe are relevant in Israel, and we find that that's indeed the case. We find a similar number of the 65 families whose information we've already received, whose genetic sequences we've received. We find that in about 20% of them, we find genetic disorders that are very similar to what have been reported elsewhere. And having this knowledge is really important for two reasons. One is that we have this additional wealth of information from those MRI scans and eye tracking and sleep recordings and all of these other research projects that we can tie into the genetics. So even if there is a certain problem in the SYNGAP gene, how do we know what happens in those specific toddlers? Well, now we have this wealth of information from the database that we can relate to this. The other reason that this research is so important is from a clinical perspective, because this is amazingly critical, sensitive information for family planning. And I want you to focus on the example on the right. So this child who has a SYNGAP mutation, those mutations are actually coming from the parents. So what happens is that each one of his parents are carriers. So you know how we have 2 copies of every gene in our body? We receive one from our mother and the other from our father. Each of the parents here had one bad copy and one good copy. And unfortunately, the child inherited both of the bad copies, and that's why they have a problem with neural development and have developed autism. And knowing that is very important for the next child. So if the family wants to get pregnant again, now they can avoid a situation where there's a pregnancy with both mutated copies. So that has huge benefits. The overarching goal of all of this, the combination of genetics and everything that I've told you about, goes into clinical research. So we want to understand which kids are improving and how to change that for the better, right? So another really important aspect of our research is that the kids come back annually for an assessment. And what you see here is a comparison of the severity of symptoms during the first assessment. The ADOS test is a clinical assessment of severity. And you see those scores for the first assessment versus the second assessment, which was a year or 2 later. And if the child falls on that diagonal black line, that unity line, it means that they're not changing. The severity is the same. If they're below the line, they're getting better. If they're above the line, they're getting worse. This is actually a really optimistic picture, right? There are a lot of kids below that line who are getting better during those first 2 years after we diagnose them. And now the big question is what are the ones who are improving the most, what are they receiving, what are their characteristics, what's unique about them. Yeah, each dot here is a different child. So this is the same, these are all individual children who are coming back, and we know how they're developing over time. And so so these are long projects. You can imagine the complexity of trying to do this, right, over years. But we already have really interesting initial data showing that those who are improving are those who were diagnosed the earliest. So what you see here is those same kids, but now broken down by the age of diagnosis. And you see that those who were diagnosed before the age of 2 are the ones who are really improving remarkably, right? And that gives us, that's really reassuring, because we often tell the public that it's really important to get early diagnosis and to not waste time and go into therapy. And that really shows you the importance of that. Okay, so I just have a couple more minutes. I want to tell you that everything that we do in Soroka, now we're going to do nationally. And that involves copying this successful framework to other medical centers in the country. We're already doing that in Asaf HaRofeh. We just got clearance from all the committees and have put in a research assistant. And the really great thing about Israel is that it would be enough for us to operate within 6 or 7 sites to be capturing 75% of the population. And that's huge, because that gives us an unbiased sample of the entire country and will enable us to do really groundbreaking work. In order to do that, you need to manage a lot of politics. There are lots of organizations that are involved here, including the different universities on the bottom left, the HMOs, those are the service providers in Israel. There are 4 HMOs who do the diagnosis. 2 big organizations who supply autism services, and of course all the government offices. With the families, the parents, I'm not that concerned, because we're getting amazing feedback about this entire project. But in order to get everyone else to cooperate and collaborate, we've initiated national research meetings. The first one was in February of this year, and we just came out exhilarated by the optimistic and positive feedback that we've been getting from, you see down below there, representatives from the Health Ministry, the Science Ministry, the 2 big service providers, and about 120 researchers and clinicians from all over the country. And so as part of this, a big challenge here is to turn all those competitors who competed with us on that initial application to create the center, and we're really successful in turning them into partners. So we have discussions, and we're doing all this work together. You're all invited to the next conference, which is going to be in February of 2020. And with that, I'd like to thank all our funding agencies and private donors, without whom none of this would happen, and of course the entire team. And thank you for being here.